Florida. Home sweet home. Often referred to as the Sunshine State, we are not strangers to severe weather. From intense summertime thunderstorms, extreme heat, and tornadoes, Floridians often face a multitude of threats in any given year at any given time of year. However, one natural disaster stands out among the rest when it comes to Florida in particular, and that's hurricanes. Hurricanes are obviously not exclusive to the state of Florida. Every state along the Gulf of Mexico and up through the northeastern United States has been hit by at least one tropical or subtropical cyclone in its lifetime. However, no other U.S. state compares to Florida by sheer amount of hurricane landfalls. Sources vary, especially as more hurricanes have impacted the state in recent years, but generally speaking, the consensus is that Florida has been impacted by at least 120 hurricanes since 1851. The next closest state is Texas with 66 hurricane landfalls. So why is Florida so hurricane prone? I could bore you with all the meteorological jargon, but let's just be honest. Just look at where Florida is. It sticks out like a sore thumb on the map. Plus, being further south than almost every other U.S. state, other than Texas, means it's closer to the equator, which by proxy means a lot of warm water. Warm water is essentially the food that hurricanes feed on. With that in mind, it's easy to see why Florida has had almost as many hurricanes as it has had years in existence as a state. For reference, Florida became a part of the United States in 1845, with records on tropical cyclones beginning to be kept in 1851. So, armed with that knowledge, you may be thinking Florida is quite the hurricane magnet, and that it sees major tropical systems nearly every year. While in recent years that may be the case, there was actually a decently expansive period where Florida saw no hurricane impacts at all. Today, allow me to give you the rundown on Florida's strange history with hurricanes so far in the 21st century. But before I can explain how Florida dodged bullets for over a decade, it's important to understand Florida's modern relationship with hurricanes. The main hurricane I will point to as a turning point in the perception on how Floridians viewed hurricanes was the infamous Hurricane Andrew. In mid-August of 1992, a small tropical wave began to take shape off of the coast of Africa. Over the next week, this system would meander towards the continental United States, not really looking all too impressive. But by the 22nd, Andrew would become a hurricane. And over the next 36 hours, Andrew underwent a process known as rapid intensification, a process that at the time was not really widely known in the general consciousness. The small hurricane would explode from a Category 1 into a beast of a Category 5 hurricane. Of course, this happened within barely a day's time of landfall, leaving many people who were not expecting that big of a threat from Andrew in for a major surprise.
And here are the effects of Andrew as he begins to arrive here on Miami Beach. You can see the palms blowing, and then over here, you can see the sand. It's almost like a blizzard, a snowstorm of sand. And here you can see the wind is really picking up. In fact, the car is rocking back and forth, and I'm sure that's evident in the picture. Here's a bicycle tied to that sign that's just flapping back and forth.
On the morning of August 24th, Dade County, Florida was blasted by 175 mile-per-hour wind gusts. This is directly south of Miami, a city of nearly 350,000 people at the time. The winds of Andrew were so intense that one of the National Hurricane Center's radars in Miami was just left completely eviscerated and in shambles. And this was just as the storm made landfall, only a precursor of what was to come. After spending the morning tearing apart southern Florida, Andrew would travel back out into extremely warm ocean waters. The hurricane would make its final landfall on August 26th in southern Louisiana as a Category 3 hurricane with sustained winds of 115 miles per hour, just short of Category 4 strength. Hurricane Andrew remained Florida's costliest and most damaging tropical cyclone for 25 years until Hurricane Irma took that title in 2017. Following Hurricane Andrew, government organizations across the state of Florida began looking into how they could improve building codes to better withstand extreme winds from hurricanes. Today, buildings in the Miami-Dade area are built to withstand 190 mile per hour wind gusts, with the further parts of the Florida Keys exceeding 200 miles per hour. Thankfully, though, the rest of the 90s were relatively quiet for Florida in terms of hurricanes. Other than a quick snip from Hurricane Opal in 1995, there were no major hurricanes following Andrew. In fact, the state was receiving mostly low-grade Category 1 hurricanes and tropical storms for the rest of the decade. But then came the new millennium. The first 4 years of the 2000s were also pretty quiet, the state of Florida only seeing direct landfalls from tropical storms, no hurricanes at all. But then came 2004 and 2005. Across this 2-year period, 10 total tropical systems directly impacted Florida. In 2004, 2 hurricanes, Jeanne and Frances, would make landfall just weeks apart. Francis would landfall as a Category 2 on September 5th, with Category 3 Hurricane Jean following Francis just 20 days later in essentially the same area. If that wasn't crazy enough, there was yet another hurricane in between that time. Hurricane Ivan would make its first landfall in Gulf Shores, Alabama on September 16, 2004 as a powerful Category 3 hurricane. While the storm center didn't technically go over much of Florida, much of the effects of the storm overall did. Hurricane Ivan would do something essentially unheard of at the time and go on to fuel a full-on tornado outbreak over the course of 3 days across multiple states. Don't get me wrong, people weren't seeing EF5 Great Plains monsters in the Deep South due to Hurricane Ivan, but this is still just ridiculous to think. What's even more ridiculous is the path of Hurricane Ivan, which managed to maintain its low-pressure core across its trek over the southeastern United States. From September 18th through the 21st, the storm remained extratropical, or a low-pressure core storm without tropical characteristics that once had tropical characteristics. It would then make landfall as an extratropical cyclone in Florida again, this time on the southeastern coast instead of in the Panhandle. Granted, Ivan was incredibly weakened by this point, but it's mind-boggling that it even still got back to Florida. Further mind-boggling is that it manages to redevelop characteristics once it got back into the warm Gulf of Mexico waters. From there, it managed to cross along its original path and make landfall in southwestern Louisiana for a final time on September 24, 2004 as a weak tropical depression. And if all of that tropical insanity wasn't enough, that's still not it. Before all of this happened, in August of 2004, there was Hurricane Charlie, an absolute monster of a storm. Charlie would landfall near Punta Gorda, completely ripping the town apart with wind gusts in excess of 170 miles per hour. Charlie was the strongest storm to make landfall in the entire continental United States since his big brother Hurricane Andrew decimated Miami in 1992. And I still have to talk about 2005. Holy sh! Starting off in July of 2005, Hurricane Dennis devastated Cuba as a strong Category 4 hurricane before steamrolling straight into the Panhandle of Florida as a formidable Category 3 storm on July 10, 2005. Mind you, the same area was just slammed by Hurricane Ivan less than a year ago. Then in August, a little-known hurricane by the name of Katrina impacted the southeastern coast of Florida as a Category 1 hurricane after forming around 2 days prior in the Bahamas. Katrina then ignores the traditional notion of hurricanes weakening over land, maintaining strength over the entire southern Florida peninsula, and then intensifying near the Florida Keys into a Category 2 storm shortly after. Katrina would then slow, churning away in the Gulf, eating away with all of that warm Gulf water, exploding into a Category 5 hurricane. On the 29th of August, 2005, the storm would make landfall as a thankfully weakened Category 3 hurricane in Louisiana, but a lower number on a rating scale did not do much to prevent the mass amount of suffering that occurred in New Orleans and the surrounding areas. Lastly, something unusual occurred in October of 2005. Hurricane Wilma formed in the southern Caribbean, rapidly becoming a absolutely ravenous Category 5 hurricane. So ravenous and booming with energy, Hurricane Wilma still holds the all-time lowest barometric pressure of 882 millibars, an intensity that likely nobody will ever truly get to grasp the feeling of, as the storm was setting out over open waters at the time. From there, the storm drifted northwestward into Cancun, Mexico, making landfall on October 22, 2005, as a still immensely powerful Category 4 hurricane. The storm would go through part of the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, before curving to the northeast, with its eyes set on Florida. During this time, it was mostly at Category 2 strength, but as one last show of strength, Wilma managed to claw her way back to major hurricane status, making landfall as a Category 3 hurricane near Cape Romano, Florida, on October 24, 2005. So, it's safe to say that the 2004-2005 hurricane seasons were something exceptional. Do you see how much time that took up in the video, and that wasn't even my main point in this video? Jesus. But anyway, with such a ferocious duo of years, you'd think Mother Nature was only getting started on Florida's thrashing. Actually, no. In terms of hurricanes, you want to know what followed those 2 devastating years? Nothing. Following Hurricane Wilma in October of 2005, Florida would go into a dry spell. Now let me preface this by saying that doesn't mean there were no tropical storms. There still were. There were many major hurricanes and devastating storms across this period, just none made landfall in Florida. From October 24, 2005 to September 1, 2016, no hurricanes would make landfall in Florida. Numerous tropical storms maybe, and those were still devastating in their own regards, but no full-on hurricanes. So what happened? First, I'm going to take you through this nearly 11-year lull in tropical activity, and then I'll show you how it ended. But first, let's take a map of tropical cyclone landfalls near Florida from 2006 to 2016. Is there anything that you notice here? I noticed a distinct lack of orange, red, purple, and magenta on this map, colors that indicate stronger hurricanes on these maps. In fact, I don't even see that much yellow, which indicates Category 1 hurricanes, the bare minimum requirement for a hurricane. However, Florida would still experience some memorable storms during this time. The main ones I remember personally are Beryl and Colin from this period. Tropical Storm Beryl formed off the first coast of Florida on May 25, 2012, before the official start of hurricane season. Over the next few days, the storm would drift to the west, making landfall on May 28th as a tropical storm in St. Johns County, Florida. The main story behind the storm is it brought a lot of rain, record rainfall in fact, for our area. The second storm I really remember was Tropical Storm Colin. Tropical Storm Colin made landfall along the Big Bend of Florida on June 7, 2016, in another very early season storm. This storm was mainly significant to me because I remember it bringing severe weather to our area, including a tornado warning. But overall, this was the story of tropical cyclones from 2006 to 2016. Tropical storms would drift onshore in a portion of Florida, usually doing little more than bringing in some heavy rain and decent winds, with a little bit of storm surge, but little other problems. It wouldn't be until September 1st, 2016 that the dry spell would finally end. On that fateful day, Hurricane Hermine, packing sustained winds of 80 miles per hour, would break Florida's hurricane-free streak. It was the first hurricane to make landfall in the state since Wilma, all the way back in October of 2005. The storm would go on to cost the state $80 million in damages. With the spell lifted, it seemed like Mother Nature was wasting no time getting Florida back into the hurricane game, because just over a little more than a month later, she fired a warning shot. On October 1st, 2016, Hurricane Matthew would become a Category 5 hurricane in the extreme southern Caribbean. Matthew would make landfall a Category 4 in both Haiti and Cuba before turning into the Bahamas and aiming its sights directly at Florida. Although briefly weakening to Category 3 strength, the storm briefly caught a second wind as it was approaching central Florida as a Category 4 hurricane. And this was looking really bad. Hurricane Matthew would have been the first major hurricane to landfall in eastern Florida in over 2 decades. Throughout the day and nights of October 6th and 7th, the storm got eerily close to Florida's coast. Ultimately, though, it never made landfall in the state. Coastal counties took quite the beating, but overall, a large majority of the population of the state avoided strife. The storm would continue to scrape its way up the eastern seaboard, briefly making landfall as a Category 1 hurricane in South Carolina before dissipating in the ocean 2 days later. Matthew, a powerful Category 5 hurricane at the time, exploding in the Caribbean, sparing Florida to some degree. Sound familiar to another October hurricane in this video? Well, regardless, many Floridians breathed a sigh of relief by the end of 2016. Sure, Hurricane Hermine broke the spell, but in the grand scheme of things, the storm wasn't significant for much else. Along with Hermine, Hurricane Matthew relatively spared the state, but unfortunately, Floridians were about to be hit with a very heavy dose of reality. The 2017 hurricane season still holds the crown for the costliest Atlantic hurricane season in United States history, racking up nearly $300 billion in total damages. Irma, Harvey, and Maria. I'm sure all of these names ring a bell to you weather enthusiasts out there. For those of you who don't know, the 2017 hurricane season was incredibly active and it was especially devastating. Hurricane Harvey impacted Texas, bringing flooding the likes of which we still haven't seen in the area again. Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico, completely devastating the island. And lastly, the one I'm going to focus on is the infamous Hurricane Irma. Irma made landfall in Cudjoe Key, Florida on September 10, 2017 as a very strong Category 4 hurricane with winds of 130 miles per hour. On Irma's trek to Florida, it had at one point reached sustained winds of 180 miles per hour, making it an insanely strong Category 5 hurricane and making it one of the most intense in history. But at the end of the day, the exact wind speeds or category don't really matter all that much. Most of Florida's nearly 21 million people were affected by Irma as it raked its way up Florida's western peninsula, maintaining hurricane strength for a decent amount of the way. It was a tropical storm when it passed our area in northeastern Florida. Our town was still completely covered in tree debris, power lines were down, and power was out for days. Irma was an absolutely devastating gut punch to Florida and her people. But just like in 2004 and 2005, Mother Nature had another monster lined up, but it would wait until the next season. In 2018, Florida would once again experience the fury of a Category 5 hurricane. On October 10, 2018, Hurricane Michael would make landfall in the Florida Panhandle. Remaining at Category 4 strength for a majority of its trek up Florida west coast, Michael managed to gather up one last burst of strength, becoming the first Category 5 landfall in Florida since 1992. Did you know only 4 Category 5 hurricanes have made landfall in the mainland United States? Yeah, well, 3 of them hit Florida. Go figure. And in 2019, we could have added a 5th one to that list. On September 1st, 2019, Hurricane Dorian would impact the Bahamas as a devastating Category 5 hurricane. The storm would quite literally sit and wobble over the islands for more than 24 hours, thrashing its people relentlessly. After leaving the Bahamas, there were concerns that the hurricane would make it to Florida's eastern coastline. Were we about to see a repeat of Hurricane Andrew? Well, no. Dorian actually ran parallel to the Florida coastline, similarly to how Hurricane Matthew did in 2016. However, Dorian's core was well over 100 miles from Florida, making its impacts on the state relatively minimal. Florida was spared from another disaster, but not for long. 2020 would see a handful of weaker tropical systems impacting Florida, which is surprising considering 2020 was the most active Atlantic hurricane season in history. Though there was one pretty decent hit, and that was Hurricane Sally. Technically speaking, the center of the storm barely passed over Florida, but the effects were felt throughout the entire panhandle. Sally made landfall in Gulf Shores, Alabama on the 16th of September 2020. The storm brought impressive rainfall and storm surge to the panhandle, but overall the storm was nowhere near as impactful as Michael, which had hit the area 2 years earlier. 2021 was actually very similar to 2020 in this regard. This time, no hurricanes made landfall, but numerous tropical storms would impact the state. But the main one I want to point out is Hurricane Elsa. A relatively weak storm, Elsa only obtained Category 1 strength for a brief period in the Gulf of Mexico. However, when the storm made landfall on July 7th, it had already weakened back to tropical storm strength. This storm was mostly notable for dropping a large EF2 tornado near Jacksonville. I believe that one was in Camden County, and there was an EF1 tornado in Jacksonville itself. Tropical Storm Elsa deserves its own episode of Severely Overlooked, so keep your eyes peeled for that one. I'm going to do that during hurricane season. Finally, we arrive at the most recent completed hurricane season, which was 2022. As Florida was beginning to truly readjust to life post-COVID-19, Mother Nature thought we were ready for another big storm. You all know what I'm talking about. Hurricane Ian. Ian would absolutely decimate southwestern Florida, especially areas like Port Charlotte. The hurricane did approach land as Category 5, but apparently weakened to just below Category 5 hours before landfall on September 28th. In my opinion, I wouldn't be surprised if in the next year or two they go back and reevaluate Hurricane Ian. This is actually what happened with Hurricane Michael in 2018, when the storm was initially ranked with a maximum category of 4, and that's how it was being presented throughout active coverage of the storm. The damage afterwards ended up being so devastating to the Panhandle, however, that it made everyone, including the National Hurricane Center, take a second look. Regardless of rating, Ian was the most devastating storm that Florida had experienced in nearly 4 years. But 2022 was notable for more than just Ian. On November 10th, Hurricane Nicole would make landfall near Port St. Lucie as a formidable Category 1 hurricane. Nicole would cross the path that Ian had made less than 2 months earlier, scraping along most of central Florida. And that's it, y'all. A brief history of Florida's hurricanes in the 21st century, along with the amazing dry spell that lasted from 2006 to 2016. For the sake of brevity, I left out quite a few events, mainly tropical storm landfalls, like Tropical Storm Alberto. At some point in the near future, I plan on doing a video covering specifically tropical storms and not hurricanes. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. If you did, you know what to do. Like, share, subscribe. Have a good day, y'all. And please stay safe out there.